Hello again, 102. In this video, we will describe the impact of the Great Depression on the American people. And we've already been talking about the soaring unemployment, the spreading poverty, and the failure of local efforts at relief. The system is just overwhelmed by this calamity. National unemployment soared to 4 million in 1930, 8 million in 1931, and 12 million by 1932. Some 6,000 jobless New Yorkers sold apples on street corners. And in the famous novel of the time, The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, will chronicle some of the calamities facing Okies and other Midwesterners in trying to cope and survive with the Great Depression. Very famous novel, well worth a look if you have a chance. Hunger is widespread. In rural Appalachia, a sickly child was told to go home and get something to eat. "I can't," she replied. "It's my sister's turn to eat." In 1931, New York City hospitals reported 100 cases of actual starvation, where people died solely from a lack of food. Hungry people by the millions lined up at soup kitchens where minimal amounts of food and water were distributed. Others rummaged through trash cans behind restaurants. In Detroit, we saw the city at its worst, wrote Louise V. Armstrong. One vivid, gruesome moment of those dark days we shall never forget. We saw a crowd of some 50 men fighting over a barrel of garbage which had been set outside the back door of a restaurant. Americans fighting over scraps of food like animals. Homelessness was widespread. The contraction of the economy especially squeezed debtors who had monthly mortgages or installment debts to pay. 1,000 Americans per day lost their homes to foreclosure. At first, the poor made homeless by the Depression were usually placed in poorhouses or workhouses. By 1933, however, the number of homeless overwhelmed the small number of public facilities. People were forced to live under bridges, on park benches, and in doorways and police stations. And here you have a gentleman that's living in a shanty town shack that he constructed of whatever materials he could find in this makeshift dwelling outside or near Chicago. This is his chimney. So he must have some kind of heat, because you're going to need heat at some point living in Chicago, Illinois. It gets cold there. Millions of homeless people, mostly men, simply took to living on the road or the rails. These hobos, or tramps as they were called, walked, hitchhiked in cars, or sneaked onto empty railway cars and rode from town to town, seeking work or food. One railroad, the Missouri Pacific, counted 200,000 people living in its empty boxcars, which they have plenty of because business is very, very slow in 1931. As always, those hardest hit were the most disadvantaged groups: immigrants, women, farmers, the urban unemployed, Native Americans, and African Americans. Desperate conditions did lead desperate people to do desperate things. Crime soared during the 1930s, as did street corner begging, homelessness, and prostitution. Families were in distress, again because of crime, also because of desertion, and there was a declining birth rate. Some 1.5 million husbands left home during the 30s. With their futures so uncertain, married couples such as my grandparents Ray and Virginia decided not to have children, or they put it off. My dad was not born until December of 1936, and they had been married for quite a few years before that. Birth rates plummeted during the 1930s. By 1932, 20% of working women were unemployed, which was a slightly lower percentage than men. On the one hand, because women held a disproportionate number of the lowest paying jobs, they were often able to keep their jobs as employers laid off higher paid men. But as the Depression deepened, however, married women in the workforce became the primary targets of layoffs. Some 26 states passed laws prohibiting the employment of married women. And the condition of these groups, a blues song called Hard Times Ain't Gone Nowhere revealed, hard times don't worry me. I was broke when it first started out. Some 3 million rural blacks in the South lived in cramped cabins without electricity, running water, or bathrooms. Blacks who had left the poverty-stricken South to take factory jobs in the North during the Great Migration were among the first to be laid off. African Americans across the nation had the highest rates of joblessness in the early years of the Great Depression. 50 to 60% were unemployed. Impoverished whites found themselves competing with local Hispanics and Asians for seasonal farm work in the cotton fields or orchards of large corporate farms. Many Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino laborers moved to the cities. Mexicans were also mostly migrant farm workers, traveling from farm to farm to work during the harvest and planting seasons of the different crops. They settled in California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Texas, and the Midwestern states. And as economic conditions worsened, government officials called for the deportation of Mexican-born Americans in order to avoid the cost of providing them with public services. And by 1935, over 500,000 Mexicans were deported. Again, Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, details the Dust Bowl migrants. And there is a Dust Bowl defined. It was a vast area of the Midwest where the windstorms blew away the topsoil because there was a long drought in what has sometimes been called the Great American Desert. During World War I, demand was so high for American foodstuffs that they over-farmed a lot of this territory, which they got away with while the rains were happening. But once it stopped raining and all of this land had been plowed up and also overgrazed by cattle, it caused great social distress, and a massive migration of farm families from the Midwest took place. And by 1938, over 25 million acres of prairie land had lost their topsoil. It would be night during the day during some of these dust storms. Human misery paralleled the environmental devastation. Parched farmers could not pay their debts, and banks, as we mentioned already, foreclosed on their property. And here you have the Okies on the run. This is a sharecropping family, got in their Ford probably, and made their way out to Bakersfield, California, after they got blowed out of Oklahoma. Most people uprooted by the Dust Bowl went to California's urban areas like LA, San Diego, or San Francisco. Others moved to the San Joaquin Valley, the agricultural heartland of California. There they discovered that rural California was no paradise. Only a few of the Dust Bowl migrants could afford to buy land. Most lived in tents or crude cabins, and they were frequently on the move. Migrant workers suffered from exposure to the elements, poor sanitation, and social abuse. As an Okie reported, when the big farmers need us, they call us migrants. And when we've picked their crop, we're bums. And we've got to get out.